This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and by the Israel Institute, enhancing the study and knowledge of modern Israel. We like to try to enhance the study and knowledge of everything.
That's what we're here for.
I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Dr. Shira Klein, who teaches modern history at Chapman University in California. Her first book, entitled Italy's Jews from Emancipation to Fascism, has just been published in English by Cambridge University Press. Shira Klein, hello and welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. I like that part, her first book. That's promising.
First of many.
Exactly.
First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Your book tells two aspects of Italy's Jewish story that are complementary rather than contradictory, even though at first glance it may seem like the contrary. And they are both reflecting the fervent patriotism of Italy's Jews that did not abate even on the eve of the Second World War, with the passage of the race laws in 1938, even during the Holocaust, and certainly not in the post-war era. So, by way of introduction, maybe we should ask, why do you think Jews tended to tell such a forgiving story of the nation's darkest hour?
That's really the question I set out to answer in the book. So, shall I maybe backtrack and just explain what you just did in a few more words, which is what Italian Jews have said and sort of what their approach has been. So maybe I'll begin just with a tiny little story, which was that a few years ago I interviewed a woman, and it was a bright California morning, and I came and I said, tell me about your life. And she said, before we do anything, I just want to tell you that Italians are the most wonderful, wonderful people, and I never, ever experienced any anti-Semitism there. And I thought, well, that's very odd, because I knew a little bit of her story, enough to know that she was worth interviewing. And she had been, along with all other Italian Jews, a victim of the racial laws in 1938, when Italy seemingly suddenly, out of the blue, suddenly passed a series of very brutal anti-Semitic laws against its tiny minority of 45,000 Italian Jews, who made up just 0.1% of the population. And she had been a victim of these laws, and she'd had to flee along with her family. She was kicked out of school. Her father was interned in a concentration camp, also because he was foreign. And her family business totally crumbled, and they left the country and fled to the United States. And here she was saying this very interesting statement, Italians are just wonderful. I never experienced any anti-Semitism. And I found that recurring again and again and again in the sources that I looked at by Italian Jews, whether they were memoirs written long after the time, or even newspaper articles written in 1945, 1946, just after the Second World War finished. So I set out to discover why, and I discovered that it was part of a larger picture. In other words, that Italian Jews weren't the only ones who were saying this, that Italy had a reputation, sort of more generally, a reputation for being the good Axis, and sort of the Axis power that, despite being allied with Hitler and with Japan, saved Jews. And that was its role in World War II. Italy equaled the saviors of the Jews.
Who has that myth? Because I have to tell you that we've been discussing my levels of ignorance here. And, we know the general history, but there are countries that are better known for saving their Jews, right? Even if those are partially myths. Denmark, Bulgaria. Do people really believe that Italy was, the good guy in this?
Yeah, absolutely. Less so historians, right? And I wasn't the first one to say, oh, this is a myth. It's known among historians as the myth of the Brava Gente, the good people, or Italians as the good people. But absolutely in the public media. So you might have been reading too many history books. And so exactly, so you're too knowledgeable. So that's that.
And you didn't watch Life is Beautiful, which is a crime in and of itself.
Why do you accuse me of that? I'm innocent. I watched it and I loved it.
So Life is Beautiful is a classic example of that. I'm glad you mentioned it, because Life is Beautiful shows history in the most warped way. To give you just one example, it starts in 1939 and it features a Jewish man, right? The hero is a Jewish man, and he's totally carefree. Even the opening scenes are this sort of, he's quoting Italian poetry, and the music is lovely, and they're in the Italian countryside. Not a care in the world. Now, this is months into the racist campaign. Jews could not work in most professions. They couldn't marry non-Jews. Their children were kicked out of school and out of all schools, which was even worse than Germany at this time. Every single school kicked Jews out of their premises. And they couldn't go to the seaside. They couldn't advertise. They couldn't... So the list goes on and on, right? You name it was probably there. And yet this film shows this Jewish man as having not a care in the world, right? Then it goes on to show him marrying a Christian woman. That couldn't have been, right? That just absolutely couldn't have been. And then it goes on to show little fragments of anti-Semitism, but they're always portrayed as just really nothing serious. And they're always compared to German anti-Semitism, which is portrayed as having been very serious.
But even more than that, and that ties into the larger argument about the responsibility of the Italians, is that it is normally perceived, the passage of the race laws in 1938 and the beginning of the deportation and extermination of Jews in 1943, only after the German occupation, as some sort of German coercion. Only when the Germans twisted the Mussolini's arm, only then he became anti-Semitic. Is there any historical truth in that at all?
Exactly, right, exactly. I mean, so that's one factor. So sometimes the myth is that anti-Semitism only came after the Germans arrived in 1943. Sometimes it takes the shape of, well, there was anti-Semitism, but it just wasn't serious. Sometimes there is the myth that it was only Mussolini and his henchmen that were anti-Semitic, but the rest of Italians, the rank and file, never supported him. So, and no, there's no truth in any of that, because the racial laws were there for 5 very long, very isolating years.
And how much were they implemented? And were they actually enforced to the letter of the law?
They were absolutely enforced. Yes, they're absolutely enforced. Now, there are very few cases in which they were either not enforced or cancelled. But if you look at them very closely, and other historians have done this, you see that it's only when there's some sort of conflict with, let's say, labour laws, or conflict with the Vatican, who are worried about converts, right? Or a conflict with interests of Catholics who might be hurt by these laws. So it's only in those very few cases that there were exceptions. But just to go back to what you said you didn't notice it in the film, and that's highly understandable, because that's exactly the stuff of history that doesn't make it into the film, right? And so Life is Beautiful is a prime example of how this myth is circulating without people even being aware that things were not as they seemed, things were not as they
But I have
were.
to say that there is some element of truth in that, because unlike Nazi Germany, that, were focused on the Jews from the outset, we have to bear in mind that Mussolini came to power more than a decade before Hitler. And he only enacted the race laws 16 years afterwards. So between 1922 and 1938, the fascist regime wasn't specifically or particularly anti-Jewish. And also, if they wanted to exterminate the Jews or deport them to, give them away to the Germans, they could have done it long before 1943. Even if it wasn't for the right reasons, in a way, they still, empirically, at the end of the day, were less anti-Jewish than so many other European nations at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I don't think there's any argument about that. I mean, in other words, Mussolini was not Hitler, Italy was not Germany, and the fascists were not the Nazis.
But they weren't even the French or the Dutch or all the other
They were very similar to the French. They had
they?
a very similar story to Vichy France, yes, because in the same way that Vichy France takes the initiative and takes a very active role in hunting down the Jews and passing them over to the Germans, knowing full well that they're going to be taken to Auschwitz. In the very same way, the Italians after 1943, who, by the way, had full control over administrative powers, which meant over the police, they initiated a law saying that Italian Jews would be hunted down by Italian police. And this was an Italian-initiated law and handed over to the Germans, again, knowing full well that they would be sent to Auschwitz. So the comparison with France is a very apt one, and it's actually a very close one. Vichy France and the Republic of Salo in Italy have many strands in common in that sense.
No, so it seems like there's a couple of sort of qualifying points or, challenges to why it's been difficult to arrive at this conclusion. One is that maybe the implementation of that these virulent forms of anti-Semitism and the legislation around them and the actual policies simply came later, long after fascism had arisen. And so maybe that is a distinction, and that during the interim, could it be that the Jews who lived there didn't feel anti-Semitism from regular people that they interacted with day to day? I mean, you'll rarely hear a French Jew, I'm sorry to say anything like that about France. They all feel anti-Semitism. I've never met a French Jew who doesn't feel anti-Semitism in France at some point in history, and often now, but certainly then. I mean, yes, they wanted to feel like, I didn't talk to them in the 1940s, but I would be hard-pressed to imagine a French person looking back and saying there was no anti-Semitism in France. And so maybe their experience day-to-day, maybe people are influenced in their memory by their regular life. And then these policies come along and they feel like they're alien. And they feel like even if they blame somebody else, or whether they blame Italians or whether they blame the German imposition, maybe they just feel like it's a limited, anomalous phase or something.
I think that's a really astute point, and I think that's very much part of what I was trying to argue in the book. That, and this gets back to your first question, which I sort of elegantly skirted, which is
we know how to bring you back. We know where you live.
Very crafty, which is why then do Jews support this narrative? And I think a very large part of the answer to that question is the decades before the war, and just how unbelievably integrated Italian Jews were in Italian society. And that's why I begin the book with 1848, which is the first sort of stage of emancipation of the Jews. And it sets the ball going for Jews becoming extremely integrated, quite well off. In other words, they climb up the social ladder and join the middle class, and simply happy. They're happy in Italy. And do they experience anti-Semitism? Absolutely. And that, again, is a myth about the decades before World War II that there was no anti-Semitism. And that's just not true. Particularly in Rome, and particularly encouraged by the church, there was virulent anti-Semitism. But again, if we're sort of speaking comparisons, there was no Dreyfus affair in Italy. And someone I once spoke to put it in a nice way. He said, in Italy there were many Dreyfuses, but no Dreyfus affair, meaning in Italy there were many Jewish officers, and in fact the Jews were just the military was hugely popular among Jews, and they became admirals. They reached the highest positions, but there was no Dreyfus affair, right? There was no sort of huge outbreak of anti-Semitism at any point. And I think, like you said, Dalia, that was that's definitely a reason for the way they forged their memory later, because they see it, and I think you put it really well, they see it as a sort of parenthetical nightmare. World War II, the years 38 to 45 become this sort of parenthetical nightmare, saying this is not the true Italy.
I think parenthetical nightmare is a much better way of putting it.
Yeah. No, and actually I think that it's interesting, because this is how many German Jews see their country, in a way, like, this sort of Nazi aberration that drove us away from our beloved motherland. And I think that it has to do also with the process of emancipation, which brings me to my next question. Take us through the story of the emancipation of Italian Jews, because first of all, it came in stages, because Italy at the time was not really a unified nation state, but rather like a devolved country. But also it came rather late, as opposed to other European countries, only in the mid-19th century. And therefore, going back to the historical arc that you look at in the book, this 100 years from emancipation to fascism, I mean, it was like so condensed, historically speaking. Jews coming to all of a sudden to prominence and staying there, and and even staying there when there's every reason in the world for them to be, taken away from it. What can you tell us about the emancipation of Italy's Jews in relation to similar processes in Germany, in France and other places in Europe?
That's a terrific question. So emancipation begins in Italy in 1848. And I think that date is telling, because what happens in 1848, among many other things, is that Italy begins to have a constitution, and this is called the Albertine Statute of 1848. And this is the founding document that will later be the constitution of the state of Italy. And the reason I say it's important is because what we really see happening is this wedding of Jewish emancipation, or rights for Jews, equal rights for Jews, and Italian statehood. So that the very notion of being free citizens, that Jews can be free citizens, is tied to Italy's becoming a state. And that that sort of leads Italian Jews to not only be grateful, but sort of to this adoration of the Italian state, right? Because as far as they're concerned, it's thanks to the Italian state that they've gained these rights. Now, it's interesting to note that the story is a little more complicated because it's not that the Italian state, which grew out of the Kingdom of Sardinia and the House of Savoy, it's not that they were that enamored by Jews, and it's not that the first thing that they wanted to do was to give the Jews citizenship and equal rights. But it was an easy way for them to satisfy liberal lobbies, and they needed those liberal lobbies to support them to become a state. But, that's something that we as historians can see later. And as far as Italian Jews could see, Italian statehood equaled Jewish rights. And just in case any listeners don't understand what emancipation means, that is emancipation, right? The process by which Jews received rights and became equal citizens. So it begins in 1848, then Italy becomes a state in the early 1860s. And
then famously, we've created Italy, now we have to create Italians.
Right, exactly, right. That was a saying that that there wasn't actually an Italy, right? That it was an imaginary concept. But for Italian Jews, there very much was an Italy, and they were really in love with it. And it just so happened that soon after the establishment of Italy undergoes an industrial wave, and Italian Jews ride that wave, and they're very well placed because they're urban and because they're in trade. They're very well placed to join this new economy, this new capitalist economy, and they thrive. And I call that, in my chapter, I call it the rise and rise of Italian Jews, because they just sort of climb up the social ladder and gain more wealth and gain more respectability. And along with wealth in Italy at that time, because it's a classist society, comes the right to vote and the right to be elected, and so they gain power positions. And to answer your question about the comparison, so Germany, I think, is a prime example of similarities and differences, because on the one hand, it happens at the same time as in Germany, right? Sort of 1848 leading to the 1860s and finally ending in 1870. But in Germany, it comes with a lot more tensions. And in Italy, the emancipation is actually led by the ruling house, the House of Savoy, whereas in Germany, it's the leading house sort of goes kicking and screaming into emancipation and is not eager.
So it's interesting, given what you said about how they saw the state as their emancipators and benefactors and were committed to it, and also leading to their rise and rise and rise. One of the very interesting points that I really did not know, obviously I have not read enough history books, is that a handful of Jews were some of the Jewish community were actually supportive of the fascists. Tell us about that. Is that part of this kind of loyalty to the state, like Italy can, my country right or wrong kind of thing?
Right. And Dalia, that's one of the points that I find the most sensitive, and that when I give talks on this subject, that's probably the topic that raises the most eyebrows and a little
They're
bit
even
more...
raising your eyebrows right now.
Right. And even more than eyebrows, how about raised voices? Because that's something that Italian Jews today actually sense a nagging discomfort with. It's a thorny point, but the fact is, and this is what I found in my research, and I think this is really a rather new point in the scholarship, which is that the majority of Italian Jews did not oppose fascism. And some of them ardently supported it, and many others were between sort of moderately supportive of it and indifferent to it.
Like Primo Levi, for example, which you cite in the book.
Right. Primo Levi only became an anti-fascist after the racial laws and during World War II. But again, if we're talking...
Because it was turned against him, right?
Right, because it turned against it. And it's fair to say that after 1938, there are very few, if any, fascist Jews, or at least any in their right mind who are still supportive of fascism. Because after 1938, it really is a slap in the face, the racial laws, and they feel that fascism is just not the right thing.
Do they try to...
I want to answer. I mean, I really want to get an answer to the question. Why? Where did it come from?
That's a great question. Why were Italian Jews in favour of fascism? And the answer really is very concrete. The answer is that when fascism comes to power on the backdrop of a highly bifurcated society, where Italy is divided between radical left and conservative or reactionist right, and Jews have a choice: are they going to back the left or back the right? Because the centre at that time is very weak. And the radical left is composed of socialists and communists who want to overthrow the government and set up a government for the workers, just as had happened in Russia, right? This is in the early 20s, 1920, 1921. It was called the Red 2 Years. And the left is composed of primarily workers, factory workers, right? People who are really suffering on the factory floors and getting together and thinking, how can we solve this? And they say the solution is a revolution. And on the other hand, there's the right who says, no, this is terrible. We need an authoritarian government. We need someone to put down the workers and to get things right again. And they're really worried. They have a lot to lose from a socialist revolution because a socialist revolution abolishes private capital. And the right, if the left is composed of workers, the right is composed of the middle class, of traders, of merchants, intellectuals, right? People who have a lot to lose, right? Lawyers, white-collar professionals.
Elites.
Elites and also just the middle class, right? People who aren't necessarily aristocrats, of which there are plenty in Italy as well. And where do Jews belong in those two camps? Jews belong to the white-collar professionals. They've joined the middle class and they've got a lot to lose. I mean, many of them even own the factories where these strikes are taking place. So that's why Jews tend to side, not because they're Jewish so much, but because of their class, they tend to side with the right. And that's why they tend to breathe a sigh of relief when Mussolini comes to power.
Yeah, it's the same. You mentioned a few names of Jews that were actively anti-fascist before 1938. And I'm assuming they were that because they were primarily socialist rather than Jewish. The Jewish identity didn't play a role in that as much as the Jewish, as you say now, the Jewish identity didn't really play a role in the others' support of fascism. But I'd like to take them and now ask you a question about really the perspective of your book, which is, how history is told in hindsight. I mean, these anti-fascist Jews were not embellished or put on a pedestal by Italian Jews in the later years, just like, the very few French resistance fighters were put on a pedestal by the entire French nation, even though they were a tiny minority, just because, it seemed morally right. They're not really part of the Jewish Italian heritage, is it? Those socialist anti-fascists, the same as you'd expect them to be, right?
Well, not until the end of World War II, but after World War II, absolutely, they become sort of the heroical canon or the canonical heroes. What is it? Absolutely.
Everybody was an anti-fascist.
Exactly. So you get the Rosselli brothers, for instance, who led an underground movement called Justice and Liberty. And up until World War II, almost no Jews will say that they'll follow them and they're eventually murdered by the fascists as well. But after World War II, they suddenly become the heroes and everybody's talking about them and everybody wants to claim that they helped them or knew them or shook their hand at some point. And so they become the heroes. And absolutely, after World War II, as I said, there's this growing discomfort with the fact that one supported fascism or one's parents or one's grandparents or today one's great-grandparents supported fascism. I can give a sort of anecdotal example of that. And I mentioned this in my book too. So one of the archives I went to of an Italian Jewish community in Italy, I sat down and I asked for papers as a historian does in an archive. And the archivist told me from the get-go, listen, every single document you want to look at, you have to get my approval for. And I said, every single document? But a historian looks at tens, sometimes hundreds of documents a day. And normally we scan them, right? Because we haven't got time because we're rushing off to the next archives. We just scan them and then we can look at them later. And he said, no, every single document. And I said, well, why is that? Because it's highly unusual for an archivist to demand that kind of thing. And he said, very delicately, he said, well, because if one of these documents happens to show that this or that person was a fascist, we can't very well have that appearing in your book. So, as I said, there's...
Wait, I have to know who this archive was.
Well...
I mean, was it a Jewish archive?
It was an Italian Jewish archive, yeah, of an Italian Jewish community. And I don't want to throw out names because I still have to work there.
But I guess I'm always curious about the attempt to control narrative.
And it's not a government archive. He's got it right. I mean, the community has a right to either show or not show their records. There was nothing...
Is that true? Is that true? Does the community have a right not to let historians tell the truth?
Absolutely, because it's privately funded, right? It's funded by the members of the community. It's not taxpayer money. I mean, the very fact that the archive is operating and that somebody's paying the archivist's salary, that's not something that I'm contributing to, right? And so,
but then you sort of wonder why they keep the documents at all. Why don't they just destroy them?
Well, and the fact is that he eventually did show me all these documents, and I'm wondering if he listens to this and if he'll ever let me back into the archive again. But
he eventually gave them to you,
right? So, he did eventually let me see the documents. You're not saying who he is,
so I think you're clear. It's interesting. Now that we're thinking about it, sorry, I'm going back to a point from a little bit before, but now that I'm rethinking, I'm sort of a little confused now that I think about it of the great enduring anti-Semitic trope of Jews who are both the holders of capital globally all around the world in a conspiratorial way and communists. Because what you're saying is in Italy, that made no sense. They were the holders of capital and they didn't want the state to nationalize.
Right.
Am I just picking up on that contradiction for the
No,
first
that's
time?
a very good point. And I think the answer to that is that anti-Semitism is rarely rational. And, and you see that in Italy, the anti-Semitic articles just do a fabulous job at conflating all these different, very contradictory categories. So they'll say things like Jews are Bolshevist conspirators who hold the banks,
Well,
right?
not just in Italy, right? It's,
right,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
I want to ask you perhaps one last question, perhaps not. We'll see how
still
time.
have another
Yeah,
one.
we're still good.
No, we may not be good, but I have lots of questions left.
One of the novelties in your book, I mean, you say in the book and you said now that much of this story has been told by historians before, but a big novelty in your book is looking at contemporary or post-war Italian Jews, especially in the diaspora, those who have gone to Israel and those who have gone to America. Can you tell us a bit about how that informed your investigation? I mean, looking at it from an international, perhaps transnational perspective, and how you can compare the two trajectories?
Yes. I wrote about Italian Jews who fled the 1938 laws to go to Palestine and those who flee the 1938 laws and go to the United States. And I originally wanted to call the book Clinging to Italy, and we eventually decided on a different title. But the idea was that in both of these places, they really hold on to their adoration for Italy. And it takes a slightly different shape in each place. In Palestine, they can't very well say, we love Italy. Why? Because Palestine is Zionist, and the diaspora among Zionists is wrong, right? You're not supposed to love the diaspora anymore. So they don't say that, but they cling to Italy in their lifestyle, in the things that they eat, in the things that they wear, in their language. So they've got this way of clinging to Italy. In the United States, it takes a different shape. They also have this nostalgia for all things Italian, but in the United States, it's probably the Italian Jews there is probably the biggest group, the group that has the strongest way of rewriting history. And they sort of really lead the way with saying Italy was never anti-Semitic. And the part of the reason that they're doing that, by the way, is almost propagandistic. It's to persuade the millions of Italian Americans in the United States who tended to be quite fascist until the US joined the war, to persuade them that they should support the quote-unquote true Italy, which is the anti-fascist Italy, right? So they're trying to tell them, turn against Mussolini. It's only Mussolini who was anti-Semitic. Turn against him.
Get back to who you really were.
Exactly. Get back to who you really were, even if Italy was actually never really anything else but fascist.
This leads into one of the questions that really was on my mind reading this, which is, I don't know if you see yourself this way, but I think that the way your book is, explores this really feeds into the debate between Daniel Jonah Goldhagen and Christopher Browning about, to what extent were Germans really inherently and endemically anti-Semitic as a people, as a country, in a sort of almost genetic way, in Goldhagen's view, which Browning says really isn't the case. I mean, he takes the completely opposite perspective, that it is a policy that came in, was adopted, and didn't have to be adopted, but it was, but it's not necessarily inherent to who they are. Does your book fit into this paradigm, this question, this binary question?
That's interesting. I've never thought of it that way. I suppose you could say that, I'm definitely not trying to make any statements about the innate quality of Italians. Absolutely not.
Maybe you're on Browning's side.
Right. On the German case, I think Browning has definitely persuaded me, but that's certainly not my area of expertise. But I suppose on the Italian case, I would just say that statements like Mussolini invented anti-Semitism, that's false, right? And many Italians were, I don't want to say anti-Semitic, but they certainly shared various stereotypes about Jews. And I see that recurring in memoirs in the interwar period all the time. Jews had six-fingered hands. Jews had tails. Jews had horns. These sort of stereotypes that are almost medieval, right? That they were somehow disfigured. But also very modern anti-Semitic stereotypes like Jews were exorbitantly rich, or Jews were much too smart, or they were abnormally crafty, or things like that. And so what I say in my book is that Mussolini didn't have to invent anti-Semitism, and that when these laws come out, it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination for rank-and-file Italians to join in and to start sort of targeting their neighbours and their competitors, because they've already got these stereotypes in
What
them.
was the backdrop of the racial laws? Why did they appear out of the blue in 1938?
That's a good question. It's not one that I've really looked into at the level of archival documents. It's more one that I've sort of looked at what other historians have said, and there's a whole range of opinions on it, ranging from Mussolini was opportunistic and he believed that the Jews really did have fabulous wealth and he saw the 1938 laws as a chance to expropriate them, to ranging to other opinions like this was part of the Italian race campaign, which begins in Africa with the conquest of Ethiopia and subjects Africans to race laws and continues with the Jews, and on to theories about it being part of a larger demographic paradigm shift in Italy, and on to ideas that it was a way to unify the Italian nation by saying here's an other that we can all sort of turn against and thereby be unified. So these are lots of reasons that historians have come up with. And I was more interested in, I suppose you could say, the Jewish response or how this affected the Jews and what Jews came to say about all of this later.
I guess the remaining question is, does it in any way match the actual Nazi, complete worldview ideology of a racial program? And it sounds like it's not quite the same thing. I mean, the options you just pointed out for why they happened were somewhere between opportunistic and pragmatic. Yeah, I mean, is that a major distinction?
I mean, that's an interesting observation. I think it begins for maybe all of those reasons or one of those reasons, but it then moves on to absolutely be very racist. And Italy had its own homebred theorists, racial theorists, and they came up with these elaborate theories. And some of them sound a bit like the Nazi theories, but some of them are called by historians the Mediterranean school, right? They've got this different brand of racism. So was it as elaborate as Nazi racial science? Probably not. Did it have terribly harmful effects on Jews, on daily life? Absolutely.
Let nobody think that I am trivializing or minimizing any of this. I'm just trying to understand sort of the differences between them.
Yeah, but for a better understanding, read Shira Klein's book, Italy's Jews from Emancipation to Fascism. Shira Klein, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalem, our producer. And now we have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then write one. And also you can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts for you, perks, book discounts, and other things as well. Check out our archive with more than 450 interviews. If you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And do not forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.
Goodbye.